So far it's going exactly like my anxiety dream last night. So, right. Okay, thanks very much, Zoe. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you so much to everyone for coming this evening. It's amazing to see all of you here and to see so many different faces. I mean, I think we've got foundation year through to postgrad, even alumni. So that's really wonderful. So my talk this evening is called Uncut Leaves on Literature and Its Uses. And this is the 6th Words Matter lecture, which means that for 6 lectures I've sat in the audience wondering what I'm going to say when it's my go. And it's this. I'm going to talk about uncut leaves, that'll make more sense in a minute, and literature and its uses. And you'll notice that I've called the lecture Literature and Its Uses and not Literature and Its Utilizations. That was a specific, discrete choice that I made. And it's something you may have heard me talk about, something that Joe and I have talked about in front of students before. The word use is different from the word utilize. Use means the manner of using or employing something, the skill of correctly handling or operating an implement. So it's to use something for the use it was originally made for. Utilize means to make or render useful or to convert the use of. That's significant. So it's the difference between saying I'm going to use a spoon to eat some ice cream and I'm going to utilize a spoon to scoop out your eye. Like, that's not what a spoon is made for, but I'm going to put it to that use. And it's the difference between saying Coleridge uses a metaphor to convey this idea, correct, rather than Coleridge utilizes this metaphor to open a door. Like, they're different words. So I'm interested in the use of literature. I want to suggest this evening as well that there is a difference between using literature and utilizing literature. So for me this evening, using literature involves a deep and sincere engagement with the matter of text, with the matter of words. It requires us to think about the actual words on the page, to unpick and understand their composition, and to think hard about what the text itself is trying to convey, and building our arguments upon that. Using literature, for me, tonight, and generally, is about understanding literature texts on their own terms. It's about engaging in good faith with what it is saying and how it's saying it, irregardless of who wrote it, when they wrote it, what was going on around them when they wrote it, or the extent to which the world in which they wrote it is different from the world that we are in now. Using literature is correctly handling literature, to use that OED definition, I think. Utilising literature is to force the text to do something that it wasn't meant to do. It's mobilising it to fit with the set of ideas that you had before you read it, if indeed you did read it. Because if you're utilising the text, you don't even have to read it. You don't need to read a single word of it. Or if you do, you can cherry pick the moments that best fit whatever preconceived ideas you're trying to prove or disprove. So in this evening's lecture, I'll examine some of the contexts where that might happen. But truthfully, I think most likely we've all done it from time to time. Every time a student says to me, I've decided on the argument of my essay, but I still need to go to the library to get my quotes, that's what's happening. Every time an academic, I'm thinking about myself at this point, submits an abstract to a conference that's happening 6 months in the future before they've carried out the research they'll be talking about, that's what is happening. When someone says they're going to do a psychoanalytic analysis of a text that they haven't read yet, it's probably going to happen. What I want to argue tonight is that we should always seek to use rather than utilise literature. More basically than that, I want to argue that we should always seek to read the texts that we want to discuss, that we should read them carefully, deeply, and on their own terms in the first instance. And of course I'm going to argue that. It's what I talk about all day, every day, isn't it? This is what I say in my seminars, in my lectures. Please read the book. Read the text. It will all be better. You'll do better. It will be better if we read the text. So I do have a secondary argument as well, one that I think is well formatted for the Words Matter lecture format. And that's that the way that we treat text when we study works, the way that we should treat text, I think, when we use them, works as a metaphor or metonym, or even on this occasion, just a symptom for something much bigger that's happening in our society, something that I'm worried about, something that I'm anxious about, and something which I hope, if we, the academics, do our job right, you, the students, and my audience this evening, will be able to remedy out there in this big old world. And that thing, the thing that I'm worried about, is the performance of participation. We talk a lot about the value of literature, the transformative power of literature, the ways in which literature can make you a better person and a better citizen, the ways in which literature can further the cause of social justice. But I want to remind us this evening that that doesn't just happen when you find yourself in close proximity to the right books. It requires work, hard work, quite a lot of it. And I think something we're witnessing in the world at large is people functionally pretending to have done the reading, pretending to have done that work, pretending to have done that thinking. What literature can help us to do, I think the main use of literature that I'll be championing this evening, is it can help us to think. It can equip us to do this work that we do urgently need to do, and hopefully empower you to be the ones who can turn this world around. So that's my thesis this evening. Why am I allowed to talk about this? So these are my credentials. So in my research, I tend to look at variations of these things on the screen here. So my research is always about the role that cheap print plays in mediating the relationship between the citizen and the state in one way or another. So how do we or citizens in the past think of themselves and their relationship to government, but also to other institutions? What role does print, typically cheap print, and in my heart of hearts, serialized print, what does that do in communicating that relationship, in navigating that relationship, in affecting that relationship? It started for me when I did my PhD, which was about a gentleman I'll be talking more about this evening called Joseph Addison. And he was a Whig politician. I won't go into this, don't worry. But there's two political affiliations available, two main ones in the 18th century, the Whigs and the Tories. Addison is a Whig. He's an essayist. And throughout his career, he actually becomes the chief Whig propagandist. That was his job title. So it wasn't something to be ashamed of. That was what he did. And he did this by publishing periodicals that furthered a Whig agenda, that persuaded people to adopt a Whig mindset, but they didn't say they were doing that, and they didn't say that they were funded by the Whig ministry, if you can imagine such a thing. So that's how it all started for me. Thought a lot about that. Later, I came to think about protest literature. I was interested in how these dynamics had worked outside of London. I ended up looking at newspapers of protest, political radical newspapers in Sheffield and York towards the end of the 18th century. And then ultimately, right now, the phase I'm in now, working often with my colleague Joe Warren, the York Research Unit for the study of satire, is thinking about satire and how satire fits into this. So the people on the screen here, this is Addison and Steele. I'll be talking more about those. This is James Montgomery, one of those Sheffield newspaper editors. And this is Eliza Haywood, who is one of the figures I've been writing about in my satire phase just recently. So my work tends to be about propaganda, protest, and satire. Two of these have a tendency to bank on the limited scrutiny of the reader, whereas one of them demands the scrutiny of the reader. So propaganda wants to obfuscate. It wants to simplify things. It wants to hide its agenda and persuade you of a certain set of ideas. Protest literature is, often, obviously, it thinks it's doing good work, and often it is, but it's about simplifying things. It's about being accessible. It's about getting a message to the maximum number of people. So that's about simplifying. One is about obfuscating, one is about simplifying, and satire, I think, seeks out complexity. Satire refuses to give you an answer to the problem that it's complicating. So that's the ways in which they're different. But all three of these things inform what I'm going to be talking about this evening. And actually, when I work on these, and when I'm going about my business in day-to-day life, there are two things that haunt me, which I'm just going to talk about very briefly, because I think they set up a lot of the ideas I'm interested in talking about this evening as well. So one of them is this, The Hammer of Witches. So this was a book, a very strange, weird book written by a 15th century German priest called Heinrich Kramer. So at the time of writing, witches were a low-key concern, a matter of everyday life, but then this book is published and it's absolutely crazy. It actually appeared recently on the podcast, The Oncoming Storm. They talked about this as well. But in this text, it says that women become witches when they sleep with the devil. They sign a pact on the anus of the devil, and it's their job to deprive men of their virile members. And if you Google image search this, do it with incognito mode on, you'll see there are lots of images of witches in this text harvesting penises and putting them in trees and nests of penises and things. And then it also explains the best way to capture, kill, and torture a witch. The clerical establishment thought that Kramer was unwell and the book was nonsense. He tried to mount a witch trial and they threw it out of court on the basis that they said that he had an excessive sexual interest in the habits of one or two of the accused. So they literally laughed him out of court. And that would have been the end of this weird book, if not for a new invention, something that I spend all of my time talking about, which was about to change the world, and that was the printing press. Thanks to the printing press, this book was quickly disseminated all across Europe. It became a best-selling book, and his weird stories about sex-obsessed satanic witches who needed to die were in every village of Europe very quickly. And what followed was 200 years of misogynistic violence. It's a story that had been written off as deranged by the clerical establishment, but was now gripped the world in what in that podcast I was talking about, they call it witch fever. So the book basically becomes a meme, and what it represents went viral. One of the reasons I wanted to start with this today, though, is because it's unclear how many people actually read it. Its reputation seems to have been more powerful than the actual substance of the text. It became a thing that people wanted to know about. The other thing I'm haunted by is a research project I did in the final year and the year after my PhD at Nostell Priory, which is a beautiful Palladian mansion in West Yorkshire, in Wakefield, on the outskirts of Wakefield. And it is a gorgeous library, as you can see here. Many, many books, all the texts you'd expect. Hume, Addison, all the big 18th century texts are in here. And my role in this project was to go to West Yorkshire Archive. I didn't actually get to spend much time here. I had to go to West Yorkshire Archive, which is near Wetherspoons, and which actually, that was a good thing. I mean that as a positive. And read the letters of Sir Roland Wynne and Lady Sabine Wynne, because many of their letters are about the books in this library. Both of them were big participants in the Republic of Letters. They had lots of thoughts on David Hume, and as I say, Joseph Addison, and all of these 18th century figures that populate the library. So I catalogued all the letters, I went through all the letters, then I went to try and match them up to the books, and I discovered that the leaves of the books were uncut. So what this means is, when you publish a book in the 18th century, you have a big bit of paper, you fold it lots of times. However many times you fold it determines what type of book it is. So if you fold it 4 times, it's quarto, etc. And then they would sell the books. But as you can see from, I should have made one earlier, but as you can see from my bit of paper, that's an issue. So you would have a letter cutter, and as you read the book, you would tear the page. And that is how we, as book historians, can see what was read. So a strange thing happens here, where Sabine and Roland Wynne are writing a lot of letters about books, but we know they didn't read them, because they are uncut leaves. Interestingly, the books that were cut were all medical books, so books on, ailments that they had. So that's 2 things I'm haunted by. The success of The Witch's Hammer thanks to the printing press, but also this question of how many people are actually reading it, and also this issue. 2 people, Sabine and Roland Wynne, writing a lot of letters to their network about the books that they've read, but we can tell that they didn't cut the pages. So these are my 4 small sections for the rest of the lecture. First of all, I'm going to talk about why it's important to do the reading. Secondly, I'm going to talk about some quick case studies of what happens when you don't do the reading. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about what it means to not do the reading in the context of literature, but also this context I see in society as a whole. And then finally, I'm going to talk about literature and social justice. And spoiler warning, I think that literature is a really powerful tool for furthering the goals of social justice. And I'm going to explain why I think that as my conclusion. One of the first things I want to quickly disambiguate, though, in section 1, is the difference between literature, that is, the books that we read, and the study of literature. And I think when we start talking about how important literature is, it's easy for these 2 to get conflated. They are both important. I'm a big fan of both. But I think they are potentially different. So literature is the books. This is the great writing, the great books by all of these people inside and outside of the canon, the voices we're covering all of the time, the actual texts. The study of literature is then doing something with those texts. I think a great reason to do a literature degree, and a reason that many people quote me all the time, is that because they love literature, and that's fantastic, and that's really good. It's also an affective, emotional, subjective attachment to text, which is a great motivator. But the actual study of text, I think, is about writing criticism. And the thing that we teach on a literature degree is how to be a writer of criticism, how to criticize text, not say they're rubbish, but how to understand, analyze, and have a view about them. I think the study of literature is about having a clear rationale and acting a logical process, being objective around these texts that hopefully we may also have this subjective, affective love of, or more often, a vitriolic resentment for and hate of. Certainly on my modules I've found often in the past. So we have that affective response, but I think what we're learning is how to have this objective way of talking about the text. So on a literature degree, we won't be teaching you how to love books, although that would be a happy side effect. We're hopefully teaching you how to be a literary critic. And this is really important to me because the kind of texts I'm interested in from the 18th century are texts that write literary criticism. Arguably, the 18th century is the origin of literary journalism. It's the bit where people, because of what's happening with the printing press, because culture is opening up, and what texts are produced are no longer the texts that have patronage from the lords and the ladies and nobility, but instead what people on the street can buy. Because of this cheap print where more and more people can have an opinion, you have this new genre of literary journalism, which is defined here by Jerry Treglow and Bridget Bennett as good writing about writing, with an emphasis on the vexed but at best mutually beneficial relationship between academic work on literature and a more public sphere. Literary journalism and literary scholarship, hello that source, grew up together in the same neighbourhood, and both can still be found there still. Historically, the study of English literature began in Grub Street. I use this slide in some of my lectures, and every time I read that last sentence, the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, because we are writers. Literature students, we are writers. And writing about writing is also about structuring thought. Every sentence is thinking. Connecting sentences is thinking further. You are having and conveying increasingly sophisticated ideas about writing. That's the bread and butter of it. And it's a tradition, as I say, that connects my historical interest to what I do on a day-to-day basis, which is write literary journalism, but also teach people how to write literary journalism. And it also says here, good writing about writing, and there is a value judgment there. The suggestion is that not all ideas are born equal. The idea gets better as you think it through and you write it. The actual process of writing makes the ideas better. There is no distinction in my mind between the origin of an idea and the writing of an idea. And I think to be able to have good ideas and write good things about literature, you really have to look at the text. Here's Ruskin from the 19th century, which is also a very fine century. So John Ruskin says, "The more I think of it, I find this conclusion more impressed upon me, that the greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and tell what it is in a plain way. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion all in one. To do good literature, literary journalism, to be good writers, we have to really look at the text and see it for what it's actually saying. And that's a lot harder than it sounds, because there are so many different lenses screaming out to be applied to the text. There's so many different things that we're bringing to that text, but in the first instance, we really have to look at it, see the words on the page for what they are, their meaning, their intention, and yes, their formal elements. So part of this is about close reading. And I think formal elements are really interesting. So for example, here's 3 quotes. I came, I saw, I conquered, find it, get it, Argos it, stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. Does anyone know what these 3 questions have got in common, just out of interest? Yeah?
They're all figures of rhetoric?
They are all figures of rhetoric, fantastic, thank you. Does anyone know the figure of rhetoric they are? It suddenly started to feel a bit like Only Connect. But no, you're very, very close. It's a tricolon. So a set of 3 units of speech put in a row, and the effect is it makes them persuasive and appealing. A rising tricolon is one where those 3 units get longer each time, and this is particularly powerful. Here's an example. When the night grows dark, when injustice weighs heavy on our hearts, when our best laid plans lay out of reach. Barack Obama. The rising tricolon. These are the kinds of things that you learn to see in text. I mean, putting a name on it that's not that important. But knowing that this is a thing that can happen and thinking about the effect of how it happens, I think, is really powerful. And you'll come to learn as well that all speeches, all arguments, including the arguments that you make, tend to feature the same 6 parts as well, which will make it better. It makes it easier and better for you to marshal your own case, but it also makes it easier to pull apart the cases of others. It makes you interrogate the written world in which we live. And what we're doing when we are writing our text, I think, is in a way appealing to the principles of oratory and debate. So here's a critic, here's a person, Rory Stewart. Never thought this day would come, but here he is, Rory Stewart, and he says this very good thing, I think. In the classical tradition, a debate is an argument between 2 people with a different point of view who are trying to discover the truth. It's an open dialogue, a difficult encounter between emotions and values with the potential of new understanding. I think debating teaches you to be analytical. You start from first principles, form a logical chain of thought, and it's a way of rehearsing how to think and how to think well. Argument, debate, is central to philosophical traditions that inform all of the humanities. And in its most, like if you boil it right down, what a debate is two or more people with a different point of view trying to discover the truth. It's an open dialogue, a difficult encounter between emotions and values with potential for creativity and new understanding. And if we're trying to account for something, we have to listen to one another for this to be productive. We have to really listen. An illumination that comes from discussion rather than a duel where two opponents slog it out until one of them gives up. Once you're able to emote and emotionally relate to the other person, only then can you have a real, genuinely productive debate. I think going through this process teaches you to think clearly, it teaches you to empathize, and it teaches you how to persuade. Good argument is connection, not only to the person you're trying to persuade, but also you are open to being persuaded. I think good debate is about trust, accountability, and honesty. It's a delicate kind of conversation, a debate conducted in good faith. And surprise, surprise, this reminds me of the 18th century. So in the 18th century, there is this thing called politeness. And we tend to think of politeness now as please and thank you, but that's the end of this process. It starts with something called a paideia. A paideia is a program of intellectual and aesthetical as well as ethical cultivation. These Whig people in the 18th century were trying to come up with a way to do everything I just said about debate and to embed it and incorporate it in their everyday lives. As John Brewer says here, the aim of politeness was to reach an accommodation with the complexities of modern life and to replace political zeal and religious bigotry with mutual conversing and dealing with people, which by teaching one to regulate one's passions and cultivate good taste would allow one to realize what was in the public interest and for the greater good. It involved both learning a technique of self-discipline and adopting the values of refined, moderate sociability. A metaphor that's often used for politeness, in fact, the word politeness derives from the word polish. The idea was that the dream of this politeness was that people would enter into conversations and debates with each other, and simply by having these moderate conversations, these refined and reasonable conversations with lots of different people, you would smash into each other and you would end up smooth, you would end up polished. So a polite person is someone who has been through a lot of these conversations and has cultivated this intellectual and aesthetical approach to life and has ended up smooth, basically. And I think of this all the time because this is how I think a seminar should work. I think this is how all of it should work. The whole point of doing this evening of public engagement is to bump into different people, to have like productive conversations, to find out things you didn't know already, to share ideas and to become polished. So that's I think a useful idea, but it goes wrong. Politeness goes wrong, as I've already alluded to. And politeness goes wrong because over the 18th century, it becomes performative. As Susan Fitzmaurice writes here, as the century progressed, politeness as a value becomes attached to certain symbols, forms and rituals that merely echo earlier notions of ease, familiarity and sociability, and thus devalue it, so that it signifies little more than the etiquette regulating personal interactions. Accordingly, politeness is associated less with the manner of interaction, the reciprocity of accommodative conversation and consideration of the other, and more with the superficial forms of polite discourse as exemplified in forms of address, ritual greetings and salutations, and a stock lexicon. What happens is that it starts with philosophy. A guy called Shaftesbury writes a book called Characteristics, The Philosophy of Politeness. And then it goes mainstream. And then you begin to get conduct books that tell people how to behave politely. And then it becomes an industry. And then by the time you get to the 1750s, you basically have a list of things that if you say and do these things, people will think you are polite. Everyone focuses on reproducing those behaviours, but what they've forgotten is that it was supposed to be about sincerely engaging in conversation and dialogue. And this is a process I think we see all the time in all of history and even now, where you have a good idea and then it becomes systematized, it becomes commodified, it enters capital, and you end up with a set of behaviours. And if you just do the right signals, then you are engaging, then you are doing the thing. Happens with politeness. I think there's the potential for it to happen with debate. This is what happens when arguing goes badly. It becomes painful, it becomes manipulative or pandering, it can become propaganda, and I think most significantly, it can manifest itself in speaking past each other. That's the problem they start to have in the 18th century. People think if I speak in this code, I am engaging in meaningful conversation. You've got two people speaking in the same code at cross purposes, and dialogue is breaking down. So it goes from being a really positive thing at the start of the 18th century to an object of satire in the middle of the 18th century, and an object of scorn and anxiety by the end of the 18th century. Good arguments, I think, are grounded in good faith. It's about engaging in that dialogue. It's about being vulnerable and being prepared to engage in that dialogue. And how does this all relate to literature? Because the text is the thing that we argue with and about, I think. If you want to say something interesting about a text, you've really got to engage with what it's saying. And you've got to think about it as your interlocutor. Not your enemy, not your opponent, but your interlocutor. It's the person with whom you are doing all of the things I've just said. It's the person, hopefully, you're going to engage in this polite debate with. So the text is both something to argue with and argue about. And we could stop lecture now, because I think that is the most important use of literature. It gives us something, a safe thing with which we can practice these cognitive skills and discursive skills. You can't offend Joseph Addison. He's been dead for 200 years. So he's a good person to practice with, or Eliza Haywood, or any of them. And actually, this person says that this is a good reason for studying the humanities. He says all of this is why the usual sneers about whether Aristotle is going to, quote, come in handy on the job are so utterly misguided. After college, says a young woman who dropped out after all of the semester, she's quoted in one of those books that advise young people to forget about higher education altogether. She says, no one cares about Hume or Kant after you finish your degree. Maybe not, but they care how well you can talk, and they care how well you can think. Studying the most challenging works of art, literature, and philosophy, being forced every day to think about the hardest things people have ever thought about, as a recent humanities graduate put it to me, is the best training you can give yourself in how to talk and how to think. And William Gierasiewicz goes on to say, at the end of his book, there's a great line that I had to include, the problem with our leaders today is not just bureaucratic cowardice, it's a lack of ability to think. So they don't tend to follow the principles of the humanities. They've not done this work with the text. They're not thinking through things. Everything becomes hollow and shallow, and I've managed to find pictures of all of them on or near a phone. So we've got our recent leaders. I had to keep updating the slide as the date got closer for obvious reasons. But also we've got our technocrats down here as well. So yeah, literature, use literature to help you to think. So that's the end of part one. Part two, I'm just going to take a drink. Part two is some examples of what happens when you don't do the reading. So for this section, I am going to go to the 18th century. This whole talk isn't about the 18th century, but this next bit is. So the 18th century, another thing that really excites me about the 18th century is the arrival of cheap print and a 24-hour consumer society means that suddenly we are in something called the public sphere, which is completely saturated with print, all kinds of print. And what this does, as I mentioned earlier, there's a shift in the arbiters of taste. So previous to the 17th and 18th century, if you want to write literature, if you're Edmund Spenser and you want to write the Fairy Queen, or if you're Shakespeare, you're going to get your money. Well, Shakespeare's slightly different because he's got his audiences in the theatre. But if you're Edmund Spenser or Philip Sidney or someone and you want to have a living doing your writing, you have to appeal to patrons, you have to write dedications to kings and queens and the nobility, and therefore it's the kings and the queens and the nobility, the upper classes, they're the ones who set the agenda in terms of art. So you tend to get a literary culture that speaks to the taste of the people who are stumping up the cash to pay for it to happen through patronage. Cheap print changes all of that because suddenly people on the street can buy things, and there's print for pretty much every different class. And surprisingly, they don't want to read the Fairy Queen. They want to read true crime, they want to read erotica, and they want to read gossip and scandal and fashion. That's what happens. That's one of the things that Alexander Pope's upset about. But this, cheap print, and the arrival of capitalism, basically, manifests itself in these coffee houses, club houses, assembly rooms like where Ask Italian is, and we have the emergence of something called a public sphere. So the notion that there is a public, that there is a bunch of people out there who aren't the king or government who might share an opinion, that happens around about this period in the 18th century. As Brian Cowan says here, The public sphere constituted the forum in which private citizens came together to exercise their reason. It was a public of private subjects. One of the most important means by which this happened was through the development of a variety of new forms of social interchange and communication, e.g., places where politeness and debate can happen between these private subjects. These were coffee houses, clubs, and the press. That's some of the most prominent examples. As such, this process offered the critical foundation for the expression and legitimacy of a truly democratic and truly reasonable public opinion. Or so it seemed at first. And I've highlighted the word reasonable because as people who do my Dawn of Print module, or as it used to be called Civil War to Civil Society, will see, there's a lot of talk in the print of the 18th century about how egalitarian and positive and reasonable this public sphere is, and how a man could learn more in a coffee shop in a day than he could in a university in 3 years just by talking to people. But it wasn't always as reasonable as it seemed, and it wasn't always as accessible as it seemed. But you do have this idea now where more and more people, the readers, can actually affect the output, not only by what they buy, but in some instances by writing into the magazine. So as it says here, the flexible, heterogeneous forms of magazine and periodical reflect a relaxed capaciousness. That means the boundaries are open, it's getting more open. Fictional and non-fictional materials coexist. Moral essays slip easily into anecdote and allegory, and the collaboration of the readership is actively solicited in the writing. Addison and Steele used to regularly say in their periodical, if you don't write in, I don't know what we're going to publish next week. Because it's coming out 3 times a week. There's only so many things we can say. Whether or not the writers who did write in were real or not, open for debate, and we can't possibly prove it. But as it says here, the frontiers between literary genres, as between authors and readers, or genuine and fictitious correspondence, are comfortably intermediate. But you do begin to have this bottom-up culture, or this vision of a bottom-up culture emerging, and it seems, the way they talk about it, like it's this new egalitarian utopia. The problem is, well, it's not really a problem, a characteristic of it is that these periodicals are telling people what to think. And often you get a case where a big book would come out, and then there'd be a 2-page periodical. People would read the periodical and not the book, and then have lots of opinions about the book that they could then trade in the coffee house. As explained in this fantastic book, really informative for me, telling people what to think, early 18th century periodicals from the Review to the Rambler. And as J.A. Downey and Thomas N. Corns talk about, you do begin to get hidden political agendas in these periodicals. This is where that Whiggish propaganda comes from. You get the emergence of oblique rather than explicit political comment. So if you compare, like if you read a Civil War news book, it's not ambiguous what it's arguing. It's royalist or it's not. Here, you have to read 55 issues of the Freeholder to realise it's Whig. Like, they're much more oblique. But you have these essays, and they're appearing with the deliberate intention of telling people what to think. What this leads to is a culture of commentary, but not necessarily a culture of reading. And that's something that Rose Macaulay makes fun of in her wonderful satirical history of England, Life Among the English. When she's talking about the 18th century, the Augustans is a term we use for early 18th century, she says, the Augustans ushered in the new century with polish. There's that word polish. She's alluding to politeness. So this idea that people can bump into each other and become better. But then she says, high living, and if not high thinking, at least incessant talking prevailed among the more leisured classes. Conversation was ardently pursued. Men rose of a morning, met at their pet coffee houses, exchanged the news, and talked. Later they went to dinner and still talked. Then walked and talked in park or mall, then to assembly or play and talked more, then again to coffee or chocolate house where they played and talked till midnight. So she's obviously, it's a satire, she's making fun of them. But there is this notion that you've got all of these people in the public sphere having conversations about things that they haven't read. High living, if not high thinking, at least incessant talking. And they can have opinions because these periodicals are telling them what opinions to have. This is a great subject for satire. Satire is designed to attack or ridicule. It uses wit or ridicule to do it. It's designed to attack vice or folly. It uses wit or ridicule to do this. It uses exaggeration to do this. And its victims come from the real world. I could talk for hours about satire and what it is and the various definitions of it, but this is the one that I thought was most useful for tonight. So Emrys Jones, reviewing Ashley Marshall's book, says, Marshall, critic I have a great deal of time for, rejects a number of traditional ideas about satire's common components. Not all satires are indignant, for instance, and offers in their place a descriptive characterization that points to satire as an elaborate form of critique. This is how I started the lecture, isn't it? Writing criticism, critique. The difference with satire is satire is critique plus distortion, critique plus humour, critique plus gratuitousness in motive. Satire is critique, but extra. And this is a great topic for satire. This idea that you have a public sphere of people who are pretending that they've read lots of things that they haven't really read. And I've got a couple of quick case studies of where we know that, well, where it strongly seems that people hadn't done the reading and there were severe consequences. The first is Daniel Defoe's Shortest Way with Dissenters. So Daniel Defoe, best known for Robinson Crusoe, published this pamphlet in 1702 called The Shortest Way with Dissenters. And here's what it's like. Alas, the Church of England, what with Popery on one hand and schismatics on the other, how has she been crucified between two thieves? Now let us crucify the thieves. Let her foundations be established upon the destruction of her enemies, the doors of mercy always open to returning part of the deluded people. Let the obstinate be ruled with the rod of iron, and may God Almighty put into the hearts of all the friends of truth to lift up a standard against pride and antichrist, that the posterity of the sons of error may be rooted out from the face of this land forever. This is not what Daniel Defoe normally writes like. What he was doing is he was writing a parody of actual sermons by two high Tory firebrand priests called Sackville and Leslie. He's doing an impression of them. Unfortunately, he's got into a bit of bother because two things seem to have happened. People didn't realise that he was parodying something specific. People didn't realise that he was kidding. And some people actually agreed with him. And he had a situation... So you've got people who are saying, thank God, I'm so glad that Daniel Defoe finally said this, even though it's supposed to be over the top and insane. But then you also have people who don't like Daniel Defoe's politics pretending that he meant this when he didn't, pretending that he didn't mean it as a parody. And he got a lot of flack for this in various pamphlets until a year later he published a brief explanation of a late pamphlet entitled The Shortest Way with Dissenters. And in his defence of the work, Defoe strained to reassure audiences that he had intended to, quote, make other people's thoughts speak in his world, and to, quote, speak in the vitriolic language of the high Tories in order to make them acknowledge it to be theirs. So his idea was for high Tory clergymen to see this and think, oh my goodness, that's a bit much. Is that what we sound like? But instead they thought, wow, that's great. The mask, in this instance, was far too convincing. And even if an author were able to signal to contemporary readers a distinction between what they uttered as themselves and what they uttered from behind a mask, there's no distinction that would stand either the test of time or bad faith readings, which I think is something that Daniel Defoe encountered. Here's another example. So The Grumbling Hive. This is a poem written by Bernard Mandeville. It'll be familiar to those of you in the room who've done Dawn of Print. So in this poem, he suggests that all of society, like good society, successful societies, to some extent have vice within them. And they turn a blind eye to vice, and it greases the wheels of success. As he says here, then leave complaints. Fools only strive to make a great and honest hive. That's an allegory for society. To enjoy the world's conveniences. Be famed in war, yet live in ease, without great vices, is a vain utopia seated in the brain. Their utopia can't make nations live in splendour. They that would revive a golden age must be as free for acorns as for honesty. So he's saying if you want convenience, if you want things to be easy, and if you want everything you want all the time, then you have to accept there's going to be vice in society. He positions his poem as a satire on human folly and the hypocrisy of people who pretend that they abhor vice when they're happy to turn a blind eye to it. I mean, that's a very reductive reading, but we've only got we've not got all night, have we? So an interesting thing happens with the Fable of the Bees. So he first writes it as The Grumbling Hive in 1705. Then, many years later, in 1714, he publishes it again in a slightly expanded edition called The Fable of the Bees, or Private Virtues, Public Benefits. Publishes it again in 1723, to which he expands. It includes a few more standalone essays. And then an interesting thing happens. So all this time, nobody really minds. Like, I think it's got some fans. It obviously must have had some success to reappear, but it's not a sensational hit. Everyone isn't talking about Fable of Bees. And in 1723, the Fable of the Bees is attacked by the London Journal by an author calling themselves Theophilus Filio-Britannicus. And once the fable is attacked by the London Journal, there is a flood of similar attacks. And then later that year, there's such controversy around this text that it's presented to a grand jury in Middlesex as being a public nuisance. Mandeville is required to defend himself in court over this poem he's written, which is a satire on human folly and vice. He then publishes a 6-penny pamphlet defending the fable, but that is met by further attacks. So I think he probably should just stop here. I was saying to my students this morning, because we were talking about Tale of the Tub by Jonathan Swift, which had a similar reception. People thought that it was anti-religious. Swift just ignored them, continues to have a career. Mandeville doesn't stop. Once he's been to court, it's personal. So he writes this pamphlet defending the fable. And then a year later, he publishes it again, but with more paratext defending what he's done. Then between 1724 and 1730, 10 full-length books are written with the express purpose of attacking the fable. So different philosophers are coming out and writing monograph-level studies on what is wrong with the fable. Not just the poem, but some of the essays, but a lot of it is directed at the poem. And he just can't stop. So he publishes a part 2, a sequel, where he tries to address some of the criticism and win everyone back over. And that results in a bishop writing another attack on the fable. He retaliates again, and he basically carries on doing this until he dies. Before he dies, though, he reflects on what's happening. Why does this keep happening? I don't understand the things they're saying about my poem. I can't see them in the poem that I myself wrote. And he came to this conclusion. It's been presented by the grand jury and condemned by thousands who never saw a word of it. So his suspicion, or the suspicion he proclaims, is that people weren't reading the poem. People were reading the criticisms of the poem, and it became fashionable to put the boot in the poem. And basically you have this huge campaign that he doesn't think that people read the poem. One more case study before I get to the contemporary stuff. So, Addison, Joseph Addison, really major figure in my work. I wrote my PhD about Joseph Addison, and he's an interesting guy. He wrote periodicals. He wrote The Spectator, which is the most famous 18th century periodical, but he didn't often write as Addison. He and Richard Steele, his collaborator, would write as characters. And they didn't usually have inventive names. So The Spectator periodical was narrated by Mr. Spectator. The Freeholder was narrated by Mr. Freeholder. So they would come up with these characters. They're called eidolons, that's the technical term, and it functions much like a house style does for us today. So if you have multiple writers contributing to a periodical, they're familiar with the character and the way that character speaks, so they adopt that character and you get a house style. When he died, an interesting thing happened. Addison was very, very popular. Mr. Spectator was more popular than Addison, but the two get conflated, and you end up with this almost messianic vision of Addison. As Thackeray says here in the 19th century, a very fine century, if Swift's life was the most wretched, I think Addison's was one of the most enviable. A life prosperous and beautiful, a calm death, and immense fame, and affection afterwards for his happy and spotless name. Posterity has been kind to this amiable creature. Or as Edward and Lillian Bloom say, the road paved with Addisonian glory from Drake to Thomas Macaulay. These are both biographers. Drake was a biographer who wrote a biography of him when he first died. Thomas Macaulay in the 20th century, in the late 19th century, ran straight and uncluttered. No one had a bad word to say about Addison. An adverse effect of this is by the time you get to the 20th century, everyone thinks Addison's really boring. There's even a book that came out in the early 20th century that was called Addison Must Die or something like that. It's like, stop reading Addison, it's boring, he's really bland. This politeness business, it's a nice idea, but it doesn't make for interesting reading. Addison's really bland. All he is, as Bonamy Dubry says, he's the first Victorian, and he meant that as an insult. He meant he's a moral essayist, it's dull, it's boring. But Virginia Woolf quite liked him. She read some of the Spectator essays, and she was struck by how she liked them, but she wasn't expecting to, because everybody had told her, and her understanding was that he was really boring. She writes about this in The Common Reader. This is her explanation. She says, before the quote, she says, private libraries are full of the volumes of Addison, but for people to be so wrong about him, they must have not opened a single volume. And she goes on to say, the temptation to read Pope on Addison, that's a biography, Macaulay on Addison, Thackeray on Addison, Samuel Johnson on Addison, rather than Addison himself, is to be resisted. For you will find, if you study the Tatler or the Spectator, glance at Cato, that's one of his plays, and run through the remainder of the 6 moderate-sized volumes, that Addison is neither Pope's Addison nor anyone else's Addison, but a separate, independent individual, still capable of casting a clear-cut shape of himself upon the consciousnesses, the turbulent and distracted as it is, of 1919. So she's like, if you actually read it, he's not like people say he is. He's a writer who thinks about writing. Incidentally, I do think one of the issues with Addison is there's so much of The Spectator, it's a bit like Joe Rogan. If you want to criticise it, you're not going to listen to it, because they're like 5 hours an episode. it's similar with this. There's just so much material. But she says, yeah, people don't read it. They just read they just read about it. They don't actually read it. But she says if you rub off such incrustations as far as they are due to the corrosion of Pope's wit or the deposit of mid-Victorian lachrymosity and see what for us in our time remains, in the first place, there remains the not despicable virtue after 2 centuries of being readable. Addison can fairly lay claim to that, and then slipped in on the tide of the smooth, well-turned prose are little eddies, diminutive waterfalls, agreeably diversifying the polished surface. Polish again. We begin to take note of the whims, fancies, peculiarities on the part of the essayist, which light up the prim, impeccable countenance of the moralist and convince us that, however tightly he may purse his lips, his eyes are very bright and not so shallow after all. He is alert to his fingertips. He's a writer who thinks about his words. This was really illuminating for me because I think he does a lot of satire, but a lot of critics didn't until recently because they weren't reading it. That's Wolf's reading anyway. Okay, so the next 2 sections are much shorter. So what does it mean to not do the writing, not do the reading? Well, I think beyond literature, part of what this is a symptom of what other people than me have referred to as the performance of participation in a postmodern world. There's a book all about it called Dead Souls by Sam Riviere, which is satire on small publishing industry. And he says this. He's talking about poets. He says, these hopeful poets, coaxed out of their cottages and manors, their terrace and first floor flats, were of course willfully oblivious to the fact that 99 out of 100 poetry anthologies were read by precisely no one, that they simply travelled from shelf to shelf, unopened and unread, eventually reuniting with their unopened and unread siblings in charity shops and second-hand bookshops, and when further years have passed and their obscurity was assured, they were quietly disposed of. That is, pulped and burned, as the sheer quantity of the unwanted and near identical poetry anthologies had finally become intolerable to the typical second-hand bookshop owner who had long ago abandoned all hope of seeing even a single copy. What Sam Riviere does in this book, which I think is very, very interesting, Sam Riviere. What Sam Riviere does in this fantastic book is he suggests that nobody reads poetry. Nobody really reads poetry. The people go to poetry readings and sit through poetry readings and pretend to appreciate it, but no one's really listening. It's an exaggeration, it's a satire, but he uses that as a metaphor for what he sees happening in society as a whole. Everything becomes performative rather than sincere. And I think one place where we see this is social media. This is what I'm most anxious about, and this is what I think literature can help us to address. So here's Max Fisher in his recent book, just came out, The Chaos Machine. His algorithms consistently select context that evokes anger and outrage from its users to maximize engagement. Think about that. Someone is trying to annoy us to maximize engagement. They are feeding off of our negative energy so that they can demonstrate advertising revenue. As one of Facebook's own researchers put it, our algorithms exploit the human's brain's attractions to diversiveness, leveraging that flaw to gain user attention and increase time on the platform. Twitter and Facebook are engineered in ways that supercharge identity into a matter of totalizing an existential conflict. There is something that exists in this world which is designed to upset us, that is designed to divide us, that is designed to be a place where we become enraged so that some other person can get revenue through advertising. I can't believe it. And it doesn't surprise me that the business model is outraged, because Juvenal actually said, right back in the Roman times, that if nature denies, if you're trying to think of something to write and nature denies, indignation will make the verse. It's easiest to be angry. And it also, I think, becomes quickly performative, much like the politeness we saw in the 18th century, and it's not long before tribalism begins to replace thinking. We are told all the time what angle to take, wherever you are on the spectrum. It's like, this is the angle you should take. Take it now or you'll be destroyed. Like, that seems to be the business model of the chaos machine. And it affects moderates the most. So this isn't just people on 4chan who think that Hillary Clinton's eating babies and, QAnon and satanic cults and all that business. It affects the middle the most, the scientific study has suggested here. It's true, the researchers say, that users with more politically radical networks spewed more outrage overall than those with more centre of the spectrum networks, but the reward system had the greatest influence on the latter. People with politically moderate friends and followers are more sensitive to social feedback that reinforces their outrage expressions. Molly Crockett, a Yale associate professor, said, this suggests a mechanism for how moderate groups can become politically radicalised over time. through feedback loops, and that through feedback loops that exacerbate outrage. So it's coming for us, and we need to think about how we're going to engage with this if we're going to continue. If we're going to have a society that's anything like the one that was imagined by those 18th century polite people at the start of this presentation. What's all this got to do with the classroom? Here's another satire. Julia May Jonas's book Vladimir came out in 2022, and it involves an academic who returns to her office after being in a seminar, and it says, Cynthia Tong, that's another character, was waiting for me at my door when I came back from teaching. A distracted class in which I felt like I was both overly acquiescent to my students' poorly read opinions and overly combative. Not endorsing this, by the way, it's a satirical novel. They could critique only based on representation. They missed the formal elements of the story. Of course, Rebecca, the novel by Daphne du Maurier, is in many ways a story that is erected in misogyny, demonising women, demonising the other. But I was not interested in that for them. I wanted them to see how suspense was created, how symbols were utilised, how repetition made the ghost of Rebecca rise from the page. Again and again, I told them, you need to see these things, these forms. Oh, they drove me crazy, being so completely obsessed with whether or not people were represented well, wanting every piece of literature to be some utopian screed of fairness. So it's hyperbolic, it's satire, but what this person is talking about is the instinct to impose something off the text rather than see the text for what it is, its forms. What do we lose when we do this? Well, let me quote a very wise man called Alex Wiley. He says, it's surely by now painfully apparent that our democracy operates when it does through the citizen's fantasy of participation, which masks a deeper, guiltier yearning for the consolations of passivity. The citizen is a subject pretending to be a citizen, a spectre masquerading as a player. So the suggestion here, and that I'm making this evening, is that there is a huge incentive to perform all of these things, but to actually do them, to actually do that work, is going to make a real difference. It's going to make a real difference for these guys as well. So finally, very last thought. How can literature connect to social justice? Well, on the one hand, as Robert Easton talks about here, when we read a text, when a text addresses us, it takes us into the minds of those characters. This is often observed. For instance, I won't read the quote out, but I was teaching this book Tunnels last week by Ruto Modan, which is a satire on the Israel-Palestine conflict of all things. We talked about it for 2 hours in the seminar, and at the end, the students were saying they didn't understand this conflict before, but now they felt like they'd lived it. So that is one of the things that I think why it's valuable to really engage with these texts. But also, this is what I've been talking about all night, this idea of actually doing the reading, of actually engaging, looking these things in the faces. As Dioritsky says here, we speak of actions versus contemplation. In the Renaissance, the terms were arms and arts. But the ultimate idea of a liberal arts or humanities education is to render that distinction meaningless. There isn't life over here and work over there. The perspective that you go from studying the general, the wisdom, to come right out and say the word, are meant to interpenetrate the practice of your speciality. For while it's inevitable that you will train yourself to do at most a small set of things, reading, research, synthesizing, articulating your views, it's not inevitable that you will only think about those things. So the skills that we practice when we engage with these texts, you will take them with you to whatever you do, if you remember. So finally, I want to end just by... skip that bit. No, this is a good quote, actually. So he goes on to say, this is the rest of that quote, he goes on to say, if you do the humanities, it's the difference between becoming a doctor who is a healer. Sorry, it will make you a doctor who is a healer instead of a pill pusher, someone who treats people, not diseases. And this is where I want to end, with The Liberal Imagination by Lionel Trilling, where he argues in this amazing book that actually if you study the humanities in the ways I've been talking about tonight, if you really engage with these processes, the logical conclusions you're going to come to are going to be liberal. You are going to end up as an advocate of social justice because those are the conclusions you come to when you think deeply about these problems. As he says here, the job of criticism, what I started by saying we should be doing, what we're learning when we use literature, would seem to me then to be to recall liberalism to its first essential imagination of variousness and possibility, which implies the awareness of complexity and difficulty. To be a thinker in these ways is to seek out complexity and difficulty, to carry out the job of criticizing the liberal imagination. Literature has a unique relevance, not merely because so much of modern literature has explicitly directed itself upon politics, but more importantly, because literature is the human activity that takes the fullest and most precise account of variousness, possibility, complexity, and difficulty. It's engaging with literature rather than the literature itself that matters, that process of what we do with it. It's using literature, engaging sincerely with the matter of texts, with the texture of ideas, and learning how to develop and articulate your ideas. That's what really matters. Those are the skills I think the world needs right now. Using literature can change the way you think, but you have to do the work. And in conclusion, words may indeed matter, but really, words only matter when you make them. Thanks very much for listening. That's the end of the lecture.